My parents stood in my kitchen and told me they had sold my apartment. Not asked. Not warned me. Sold it. They spoke calmly, like the decision had already been processed and approved by everyone who mattered. I was given a move-out date. A sympathetic tone. Advice on where I could stay temporarily. They thought I would argue. Cry. Accept it. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to check, was that while they believed they owned the authority, I owned something far more dangerous. The papers. And the moment I placed them on the table, everything they were certain about began to fall apart. The first time I realized something was wrong, I was standing in my kitchen, rinsing a coffee mug I'd already cleaned once. I do that when my mind is elsewhere, repeat small tasks to stay grounded. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet I'd earned after years of working late and coming home exhausted but proud. This place was mine. Or at least, that's what I believed. My name is Hannah Cole, and until that afternoon, I thought ownership was a simple thing. My parents didn't knock. They never do. My mother, Elaine, walked in first, already talking, already settled into the space as if it still belonged to her. My father, Robert, followed, holding a thin folder like it was nothing important. "We didn't want to stress you," Elaine said, waving a hand. "But it's done." I stared at her. "What's done?" Robert cleared his throat. "We sold the apartment. In fact, it is one to the greatest offer us in happen." The words didn't land all at once. Sold. The apartment. My apartment. The one I paid into, maintained, built my routines inside. Elaine kept talking about timing, about a buyer who was very motivated, about how I could stay temporarily if I needed to. "You'll need to be out in 6 weeks, she added, gently, like she was offering help. I remember noticing how calm they looked. Confident. Certain. They weren't asking. They weren't explaining. They were informing me. And in that moment, standing barefoot on my own kitchen floor, I understood something cold and sharp. Whatever they thought they had sold, they didn't believe it had ever really been mine. Looking back, the sale itself wasn't the real shock. The shock was how natural it felt to them. I had been quiet for most of my life. Not shy, just careful. In my family, silence was praised. "Hannah never makes things difficult," my mother liked to say, usually when she was volunteering my time or deciding something on my behalf. I learned early that cooperation earned approval, and resistance earned long lectures about gratitude and sacrifice. When I bought the apartment, my parents framed it as a joint effort, even though I made the payments. They helped handle the paperwork, insisted it was easier that way. I didn't argue. I trusted them. I was busy building my career, working long hours, grateful for any help that made life smoother. Every time I let them decide something, small utilities, insurance, renovations, it reinforced the idea that my consent was optional. I didn't correct them when they spoke for me. I didn't push back when they referred to my place as the family apartment. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. Silence, I thought, kept the peace. What I didn't realize was that peace, to them, meant permission. Permission to assume. Permission to control. Permission to rewrite ownership into something that benefited them. By the time they sold my apartment without asking, they weren't being cruel in their own minds. They were being consistent. I had taught them, slowly and unintentionally, that my life was something they could rearrange as long as they sounded confident doing it. And the most painful part was admitting this truth to myself. I hadn't lost my voice that day. I had been giving it away for years. My parents didn't see themselves as overstepping. In their version of the story, they were caretakers of finances, of decisions, of futures that, in their minds, their children weren't fully equipped to manage. Elaine had always believed authority came with age. "We've lived longer," she liked to remind me, "so we know better." Robert agreed, not loudly, but with quiet nods and signatures placed where she pointed. Together, they built a system where control was framed as protection. They handled taxes. They reviewed contracts. They spoke to advisors I never met. Whenever I asked a question, I was told not to worry, everything was under control. And because nothing had gone wrong yet, I accepted that explanation as competence. Over time, their confidence hardened into ownership, not just of documents but of outcomes. They talked about my apartment as if it were a chess piece, something to be moved for the greater good. In their minds, Selling it wasn't theft. It was strategy. What they never questioned was whether they actually had the authority they believed they did. They assumed proximity meant permission. That being my parents meant being entitled to decide what stayed, what went, and who benefited. I realized later that they didn't check every document before the sale. They relied on memory, habit, and the dangerous comfort of being unchallenged for too long. They trusted the version of reality they'd been living in, one where I deferred, complied, and stayed quiet. In that world, ownership wasn't about names on paper. It was about who had always been obeyed. What unsettled them wasn't anger. It was my lack of it. When they finished explaining the sale, both Elaine and Robert waited for a reaction they'd seen before: raised voice, confusion, maybe even tears. Instead, I sat down at the small table by the window and folded my hands. I felt strangely clear, like a switch had flipped somewhere quiet and final. So I said evenly, "Which documents did you use?" Elaine blinked. "What do you mean?" "For the sale," I repeated. "Which papers did you provide to the buyer?" Robert shifted in his chair. "The usual ones. Don't worry about it." But I was already worrying, just not in the way they expected. I asked another question. Then another. Dates. Signatures. Names. Nothing dramatic. Nothing confrontational. Just specifics. The kind of questions you ask when you're no longer negotiating emotionally. Elaine laughed once, too loudly. "Hannah, you're overthinking this." Maybe. Or maybe I was finally thinking clearly. Their confidence started to crack in small ways. My father avoided my eyes. My mother filled the silence with explanations no one had asked for. The folder Robert brought stayed closed on the counter, suddenly less impressive than it had been an hour earlier. They had prepared for resistance, for pleading, for compliance. They hadn't prepared for calm. Because calm didn't look like surrender. It looked like someone checking the math after being told the total. And for the first time, I could see it in their faces, the brief, flickering uncertainty. They weren't sure anymore who was in control. And that uncertainty scared them more than any argument ever could. The truth is, I never collected those papers because I distrusted my parents. I collected them because, years ago, I learned a quiet lesson about preparedness. It happened when a coworker lost her condo in a legal dispute she never saw coming. One signature misplaced, one assumption left unchecked. Watching her pack up her life over something that could have been prevented unsettled me more than I admitted at the time. So when I finalized my apartment, I did one thing differently. I asked questions. Not accusatory ones. Practical ones. I requested copies of everything. Deeds. Addendums. Amendments. Emails confirming ownership. I stored them neatly in a labeled folder and then in a fireproof box at the back of my closet. Elaine had smiled when she saw it. "You worry too much," she said. Maybe I did. But worrying, I was learning, was different from preparing. I didn't bring up those documents again because I never needed to. Life moved on. Work consumed my attention. My parents handled what they always handled. The papers became background noise, important, but dormant, until the day my apartment was sold without my consent. Sitting across from my parents, listening to them explain my own eviction like a scheduling issue, I felt the weight of that fireproof box in my mind. Not as a weapon, not as leverage, but as truth. Those papers weren't about control. They were about clarity. I hadn't gathered them to challenge my parents. I had gathered them in case someone, someday, decided to act as if my life was theirs to rearrange. And suddenly, that day had arrived. I didn't reveal the papers that day. Not immediately. I asked my parents to come back the following evening, saying there were a few details I wanted to review together. Elaine agreed with thin patience. Robert nodded, already assuming this was a formality, my final step toward acceptance. When they returned, I had cleared the table. No coffee. No small talk. Just 3 chairs and a single folder placed neatly in the center. "This won't take long," I said. Elaine smiled tightly. "Good. We're already late." I fanned. I slid the folder toward them. Inside were copies organized, labeled, impossible to misread. I watched as Robert's expression shifted first, his brow tightening as he scanned the first page. Elaine leaned in, confident at first, then silent. That's not, she started. It is, I replied. Those are the documents tied to the apartment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain more than necessary. I let the papers speak in the language they respected most: dates, names, and signatures. The authority they thought they had was built on habit, not verification. The sale, I explained calmly, was executed without the proper authorization. Whatever agreement they'd made was legally fragile at best, invalid at worst. Robert put the papers down slowly, like they might break if handled too roughly. This doesn't make sense, Elaine said. You've always assumed, I corrected. The room felt smaller then. The certainty that had carried them through the sale evaporated, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Fear. They hadn't expected resistance backed by evidence. They hadn't imagined I'd be prepared in a way they weren't. I gathered the folder back toward me. I'm not arguing, I said. I'm informing you. For the first time since they sold my apartment, I saw it clearly on their faces. They weren't in control anymore. And they knew it. The moment the truth settled in, everything changed. Elaine was the first to react. Her voice rose, sharp and fast, jumping from disbelief to accusation without pausing for breath. I had been secretive, disrespectful, ungrateful. How dare I withhold information from my own parents? Robert tried a different angle. He leaned back, folded his arms, and spoke quietly about family loyalty and how these things should be handled privately. He warned me softly about consequences, about how messy things could become if I forced this. I listened without interrupting. They weren't responding to the papers. They were reacting to the loss of control. When anger didn't move me, Elaine reached for guilt. She talked about sacrifices, about years of support I'd never denied receiving. She reminded me how much they'd done for me, how painful it was to be treated like strangers. I didn't argue the past. I didn't raise my voice. I'm not taking anything from you, I said calmly. I'm just not giving this up. That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. The panic was subtle but unmistakable. Their words began to circle. Their threats grew vague. They asked what I wanted, then told me what I should want, then contradicted themselves entirely. For the first time, I saw how dependent their authority had been on my compliance. Without it, they had no plan, only noise. And as the room filled with that noise, I stayed still, realizing something quietly powerful. Control doesn't disappear loudly. It collapses when no one obeys anymore. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It happened in fragments: missed calls, delayed responses, sudden shifts in tone. The buyer backed out first. Not dramatically, just cautiously. Questions were raised. Documents were re-examined. What had been presented as a clean sale suddenly looked uncertain, risky. No one wanted to be caught in the middle of a dispute they hadn't signed up for. My parents blamed delays, then timing, then each other. Elaine stopped calling altogether. Robert left brief voicemails, carefully neutral, asking if I was open to discussing options. I didn't respond. The silence did what arguments never could. It forced consequences to move forward without my participation. The apartment remained mine. The sale dissolved quietly, the way many overconfident plans do when exposed to reality. There were no apologies, no admissions of fault, only distance. Friends and extended family began to hear versions of the story that painted my parents as misunderstood and me as difficult. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. The truth didn't need witnesses anymore. What surprised me most wasn't the fallout. It was how light everything felt once I stopped managing their emotions. Without the constant pull of expectation, I slept better. I breathed more easily. They had planned for obedience, for persuasion, for compliance. They hadn't planned for a daughter who stepped back and let the situation resolve itself. And in that space between what they expected and what actually happened, I found something I hadn't anticipated at all: peace. The quiet that followed gave me space to see the situation clearly for the first time without guilt blurring the edges. The apartment had never just been about property. It was about access. About who believed they had the right to decide the direction of my life. For years, I had mistaken involvement for care and control for concern. Setting boundaries felt unnatural at first, like I was breaking an unspoken rule. But boundaries, I learned, don't need justification. They only need consistency. I sent one message to my parents. It was short, calm, unemotional. I stated what was mine, what decisions were no longer shared, and what communication would look like going forward. No explanations. No defenses. They didn't reply right away. When they did, the message was careful, restrained, and unfamiliar. The certainty was gone. The authority softened into something cautious, almost polite. It was uncomfortable to read and strangely relieving. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. What I felt was settled. For the first time, my life felt appropriately sized, no longer stretched to accommodate expectations that were never mine to carry. The boundary wasn't a wall. It was a line that said, "This is where I begin." I still loved my parents. That hadn't changed. What changed was the cost of that love. And for the first time, I understood that choosing myself wasn't abandonment. It was self-respect. For a long time, I thought those papers represented protection, proof, a safety net I hoped I'd never need. But after everything that happened, I realized they meant something much deeper than ownership. They were evidence that I had trusted myself quietly, without needing validation. That at some point, even while staying silent, I had prepared for the possibility that my boundaries might be tested. Not out of fear, but out of respect for my own future. Those documents didn't take anything away from my parents. They didn't punish or embarrass them. They simply revealed the truth that had always been there. Love does not grant control, and family does not replace consent. I didn't win anything. I reclaimed something. The papers forced a pause long enough for everyone involved to see reality without assumption. They gave me the space to choose how I would live going forward, what I would share, what I would protect, and what I would no longer explain. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to ask you something. Do you think I did the right thing? For years I stayed quiet because I believed peace meant obedience. Standing up for myself wasn't easy. And it wasn't painless, but it was necessary. If you've ever been placed in a situation where family crossed a line and called it love, I hope my story shows you that protecting yourself is not betrayal. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you have handled it differently? What boundaries have you had to learn the hard way? And if there's one lesson I want you to take into your own life, it's this: know what you own, read what you sign, and never let silence replace consent. Preparation isn't distrust, it's self-respect. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach people who need them. And don't forget to comment. I read everyone.